Kahapon nang makita mula Naval Station Emilio Liwanag ang hindi matukoy na bagay sa dagat na sakop ng ating teritoryo. Naglabas daw ng inflatable boat ang China at presahang tinanggal sa pagkakatali sa bangka ng Navy ang unidentified object. Hindi naman daw pumalag ang Navy dahil nga unidentified object naman ito. Pero katulad daw ito ng nakitang metallic debris sa Busuanga kamakailan.
An encounter over disputed waters has been reported on the day U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris comes visiting. Chinese Coast Guard forcefully took a suspected rocket debris from Filipino naval station personnel. This happened several hundred yards away from Pag-asa Island. The Filipino personnel did not put up a fight. What are the implications of this incident? We discuss in this episode of The Chiefs. Welcome to The Chiefs. Ako po si Robbie Alampay. Kasama po natin online nasa Maynila si Ami Pamintuan of the Philippine Star, sa Quezon City, Lucy Cruz Valdez of News 5, and kasama po natin sa Mandaluyong dito sa studio, Ed Lingao of One News. Chiefs, happy Monday.
Happy Monday.
Hello, happy week. Happy week.
Bok, alam ko you follow these things, yung binasa natin na item. Ano bang latest update doon? Ano nga ba yung pinag-agawan na yun?
It seems to be rocket debris kasi the Chinese have been sending several rockets up into space lately. So usually yung first stage niyan they fall into the ocean.
Okay.
Can sometimes be recovered. Mukhang nagagawan sila. Parang MMDA na tow truck. Hinarangan yung tow truck, pinutol yung kable, tapos kinuha yung ano.
Pero hindi naman siguro MMDA lang to. Ami, parang nangyari to, gaya ng nabanggit natin, nangyari to just on the same day or just about the same time as itong inaabangan natin na other balita ngayong Monday. Yung meeting kanina ni BBM.
At papunta siya doon sa area malapit doon, di ba? We're monitoring kung anong mangyayari. Sasakay daw yata si Vice President Kamala Harris sa Coast Guard boat or ship, no? Ayaw nilang tinatawag na boat. Sasakay sa Coast Guard ship yata at lalabas ng... Well, sabi ni President Marcos
Mag-beach na rin siya.
Mag-beach na tayo, mag-enjoy na rin. Talaga naman napakaganda nun, sayang naman ko, hindi mag-enjoy.
Pero LCV, nagtatawanan lang sila. No? Sinabi ni President Marcos, baka naman gusto mong tingnan, siguro titingnan mo yung mga ganda. Pero tumawa lang si Kamala Harris. Sabi niya, unfortunately, that is not the life I have chosen. And of course, the more serious side to that is the Vice President of the United States reaffirming their commitment under the Mutual Defense Treaty.
At sinabi, against armed attack. Malinaw na malinaw, armed attack in the South China Sea. Malinaw na.
Against vessels and aircraft
of the military
and public vessels and public aircraft.
Yeah. That's more specific than in the Mutual Defense Treaty.
Yeah.
Mas malinaw na.
So I think it's the clearest commitment we've had in quite a while.
Teka, ano ba ibig sabihin ng public vessel?
Passenger vessels, for example, or
So it need not be military. Need not be military. Okay.
So pwedeng passenger vessel, I suppose pwedeng fishing vessels. I'm not really sure about it.
Yes.
Commercial vessels, yes.
Sige. Lahat kasi ito ng lingwaheng to, lahat ng mga salita may implikasyon. We'll get to a lot of that later on. We'll bring in our first guest after a break. Keep it here on One News. Welcome back to the Chief. Now, let's talk about that recent encounter with the Chinese Coast Guard over the West Philippine Sea. We welcome back to the program international studies expert Renato De Castro. Good evening, Professor De Castro.
Good evening. How are you
sir.
doing?
Buti naman po, si
Evening,
Professor
sir.
De Castro, kung di ako nagkakamali, nandyan sa Palawan ngayon at binabantayan ng mga development. Ay, hindi, wala. Kasi,
Parang
Cavite
Cavite
City,
Palawan.
Cavite City.
Tagal mo na dyan, sir, ah.
Cavite City. Nasa ano.
Okay. Hindi, pero Prof, we're making light of it, but put into context yung visit ni Vice President Kamala Harris, not only to Manila to meet Manila to meet President Bongbong Marcos, but to visit Palawan as well. And sabi nga nila kanina, nagkakantsawan sila, mukhang magbabakasyon ka. Pero sabi niya, hindi to bakasyon. What is she there for?
Well, of course, indicating U.S. support by going into what we consider yung frontier area of the Philippines. The westernmost island, of course, facing the West Philippine Sea, South China Sea. The same way as what she did when she visited the Korean Peninsula, she went to the demilitarized zone. And of course, look at the North Koreans from the vantage point of the South Koreans in the southern part of the demilitarized zone. So this is again an element of what we call symbolism, that we are backing you. The buck stops here. We would support the country in the face, of course, of China's expansion in the South China Sea.
And it wasn't just symbolic. Gaya ng sabi kanina ni Ami, very, very overt, very explicit statements. Does it get any more explicit than that? I mean, we have been, people had complained before about the United States waffling over its words on what exactly will trigger the Mutual Defense Treaty. Ngayon, ang statement niya kay President Marcos, we will definitely abide by our commitments under the Mutual Defense Cooperation and Treaty. Pagka may atake sa military vessels, and for that matter, gaya ng sabi ni Ed, public vessels. Does it get any more explicit than that? Meron pa tayong hinahanap sa Estados Unidos?
Of course, that's the reaffirmation. A recent reaffirmation of the Mutual Defense Treaty by the Biden administration, as of course stated originally by Secretary Anthony Blinken. What of course has been including is any attack on the armed forces of the Philippines, which is not of course in the original text of the Mutual Defense Treaty. Nasa Mutual Defense Treaty lang, any attack on Philippine public vessel, air or sea would be considered as an attack on the United States. What has been included was the armed forces of the Philippines.
So could you clarify that when you say public vessels of the Philippines, what exactly does that mean?
Usually in the 1950s, ang context niyan, of course, Philippine Air Force, tsaka Philippine Navy.
Okay. Meaning
so
government vessels.
Military. And it should be a military attack, ang context on military attack.
So it does not, kasi ang usapan namin kanina, we were thinking they were referring to, when they say public vessels, they're referring to public transport vessels, among other things. So hindi pala yun.
So ang context, government. Coast Guard,
basta government. Okay,
Philippine
Coast Guard.
Navy.
Okay. Pero on the other hand, yung mag-a-attack on the other side, yung aggressive side, kailangan din military, di ba? Under the Mutual Defense Treaty.
Hindi, any attack, hindi natin alam.
Armed attack, any armed attack.
Any armed attack. Kasi in
yung
the
Coast Guard
context,
naman ng China, di ba, under military yun?
yeah, tama, you agree, and it's armed to the teeth.
Yes.
Chinese Coast Guard vessels. They're usually they're old ships of the People's Liberation Army's Navy. They're armed, no?
Yeah.
And of course, they're given to the Chinese Coast Guard. And the Chinese Coast Guard just paint them white.
Yes. So ang tanong ngayon, dahil it's not specific, masyadong specific kasi sinabi ni Vice President kung wala siya sa wording ng Mutual Defense Treaty, in fact, yun ang hinahanap natin, di ba, na medyo tapangan naman natin yung Mutual Defense Treaty, similar to what they have with Japan. Ngayon, binding ba yung sinasabi ng mga official na yan kung hindi siya nakaspecify sa Mutual Defense Treaty?
Well, minention mo, Ami, yung Japan, no? The Japanese made it a point that there's the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty of 1961 stays as it is. What is crucial, no, in terms of U.S.-Japan security relation is that they have a policy directive. every year they agree on the interpretation of the wording of their security treaty. That is probably something we should adopt. For the Philippines, the Defense and the Department of Foreign Affairs, and of course in the case of the United States, Defense and State Department, to come out with policy directive on how the two countries should interpret the wording of the Mutual Defense Treaty.
So yun na, kailangan ba siyang in black and white? O pwede
in the treaty itself, we can keep the treaty as it is. Sa case ng Japan and the US, what is more important is their policy directive that they review every 5 or 10 years. So ito yung meaning nila. No? An arm attack should be defined under this context.
Yes.
So ayun siguro yung dapat natin tingnan rather than a review, an amendment, or sticking to the vague wordings of the Mutual Defense Treaty. You have to take into account, no? When this was formulated in 1951, ang dami, no? You have to understand yung context nun. Nagmamadali kasi we were asking for a Mutual Defense Treaty in exchange for our signing of the San Francisco Peace Treaty. So minadali yan. No? Kaya of course, everything has been formulated in general manner.
Pero sir,
Okay, so with
Okay, go ahead.
So with VP Kamala Harris affirming their commitment, and this coming at the heels of PBBM's bilateral meeting with Xi Jinping, what do you think is the impact of this diplomatically with China? Does this I don't create ripples at the very least?
China's a very good player.
Yeah.
China's a very good player. It takes into account that we have this alliance with the United States in the last 70 years. Ideal, of course, China could win us away from the US, but of course the Chinese are realistic. Now, you know for a fact that we would always use, especially under this administration, we would always use this as an alliance, as a leverage against them. And this is a reality they would have to accept. So it's a given for them. Now, the concern of the Chinese at this point in time is, of course, to manage the dispute with the Philippines, knowing for a fact that suddenly, if you have an armed encounter between the Philippine Navy and the People's Liberation Army's Navy, this could bring in the United States. So they're also very careful.
Professor, sabi niyo nga, China has always been a very good player in the international arena. The Philippines, not necessarily always, we're not necessarily thought of that way. Foreign policy is not necessarily always thought of as our strength. But what does these recent meetings do to the position and the foreign policy of President Marcos, given, gaya ng nabanggit nyo, meeting with Blinken. After that, Xi Jinping. Kanina, Kamala Harris, nasa US na naman. Sa January, China na naman, bibisita na naman tayo. How do you assess the positioning of Malacanang, of the Marcos administration, as he tries to rebalance our relations with the United States and China?
That's the term you use, balance. That we could only engage China if we, of course, base our security relations with the United States and also establishing and fostering security partnerships with other like-minded countries like Japan, Australia, South Korea. So on that basis, we could deal with China. We could leverage on our alliances and security partnerships with China. This, in a way, is our strength when we deal with China. So China will also have to take that into account, that it's dealing with a treaty ally of the United States.
Sir,
I think this is the message being sent to us by this administration. My foreign policy approach would be based on balance.
Okay. Sir, let me...
It's not anymore as a matter of I would separate from one country and I'll move to two other countries. So I think we're way beyond that rhetoric, which of course amounted to nothing.
Yes,
when the former president announced this in Beijing in October 2016. So we're moved beyond it. It's a more nuanced approach based, of course, on the need to maintain a balanced relationship with, of course, our strategic ally and, of course, the country that has the second largest economy in the world and which, of course, unfortunately, we have a territorial dispute with.
Yes, sir. Sir, let me recast Luci's question earlier in the show. Last week, we all sounded chummy-chummy with China. BBM, and Xi Jinping were talking about friendly cooperation in diplomacies. And then, just over the weekend and today, we have reports of suspicious explosions near the Pag-asa Island. And then, we had an incident with the Chinese Coast Guard where they intercepted something that the Philippine Navy was towing back to Pag-asa Island. How are we supposed to look at the timing of these events? Are they interconnected? Are they connected? Is there
I
a
don't
good
think
cop,
so.
bad cop
Yeah.
play? What?
Well, sa tactical level yan eh. I still remember this, no? Nung time ng Cuban Missile Crisis. Remember this? Remember the movie nung 13 Days, no? Na height ng Cuban Missile Crisis, the U.S. Air Force tested an ICBM at the time tension, no? Kennedy was so angry, yung classic statement niya, no? Some son of a bitches simply don't get the message. So probably this unit in the South China Sea, these Chinese units, still haven't received the message from Beijing. So, and then the same is true with our units in the West Philippine Sea. They haven't really gotten the signal from the center that there's supposed to be a cooperative relation. And this happens because we're dealing with huge bureaucracies. No, that sometimes one department will not communicate with the other. So these things happen. So we don't have to give so much significance to this, what happened recently in Pag-asa.
Pero sir, don't the Chinese have tighter controls over their military? And don't their military have tighter controls over their units compared to us?
Not if you're in Beijing. You're in Beijing, then you're communicating with your isolated units in what they call the nansha. So that's a challenge. Especially, of course, for China. China has tighter control because China is a bigger country than the Philippines, right? So these things happen. It will take some time before the message gets down that what we call the channel. That there's but even though we have this, iba yung situations sa ground eh. So this is something we also have to take into account.
Okay na,
Pero may
Professor.
karapatan ba silang kunin yung bakal na yun?
Ayun nga pinag-usapan natin kanina, there might be a convention regarding space debris that I'm not familiar with. So it's better at this point in time to just wait for more information and probably consult legal experts regarding any convention that has to do with debris from space.
Pero sir, given the proximity...
Pero since na natin eh, hindi ba dapat out of courtesy man lang eh.
Hindi, baka nga yung agreement na yun. Baka yung
Amin
agreement na yun provides na meron sovereign rights sila doon sa mga debris na yun.
Pero hindi
Whether
agawan, di ba? Hindi naman dapat agawan, di ba?
we're dealing with we're dealing with units on the field na iba yung interpretation. Units on the ground. So let's not give too much expectation from those people operating on the ground.
Okay. Prof, we've been talking about the Mutual Defense Treaty. That was very explicit today. Kanina sa The Big Story, nabanggit nyo nga yung EDCA. People are speculating about bases, reopening bases, or offering basing rights. VFA, kung anuman. All of these things considered, anong nakikita nyo na presence, activity ng U.S. military vis-a-vis being in the Philippines?
Well, the idea behind EDCA, when we were working on it, when I was with the National Security Council during the time President Aquino, is to provide access, temporary access, no basing rights. Of course, every time we talk about basing rights, this reminds us of the presence of two large American facilities before, of course, the last U.S. Marine left Subic Naval Base in November 1992. When they have, of course, control unhampered operation in Clark and Subic, and they were there day and night, 24 hours a day. From 1947 when we signed the military bases agreement of 1947 up to the time, of course, that the agreement expired supposed to have expired in 1993. So we won't see that anymore. So EDCA provides for the United States to build certain facilities that could be used by both the armed forces of the Philippines and, of course, the United States. And after, of course, the expiration of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, those facilities will, of course, be properties of the armed forces of the Philippines. So probably you will see build-up of certain airstrips, hangars, that will be of mutual use. And of course, EDCA provides that the Philippine-based commander has an unhampered access to all those EDCA sites, which was not the case when the Americans were here in Clark and Subic. So
Okay,
I don't think we
naman ako dun sa tanong na yun, no? So we were just talking about the code of conduct, remember? That,
Okay.
that we want to be able to negotiate now with the US and other ASEAN countries. And I recall you saying na ang hihingin dyan ng China will be a stop to the balikatan.
Yes. Isa yun sa mga conditions.
Yes, right. So now that we're also moving ahead with EDCA and we're going to be setting up all of these facilities, and then this presupposes that the balikatan will continue, right? So how do you think this will affect the code of conduct moving forward, especially now that there's been a bilateral meeting and that there will be more meetings between China and the Philippines, top level?
Okay. So, in-erase mo, isa lang yun sa mga contentious issues
Okay.
ng Code of Conduct. No, gusto ng China, magkaroon siya ng veto regarding sa military, which of course was immediately rejected, not only by the Philippines, but by Singapore and Malaysia. And of course,
Okay.
Indonesia, because all of these ASEAN countries are conducting military exercises with third parties, no?
So that's an
Madami pa yan.
untenable demand. Ganun ba yun?
Oo. Isa pang contentious issue dito na pinag-aawayan din natin, yung binding.
Okay.
Gusto ng ASEAN, hindi binding, legally binding. Ayaw ng China. Gusto ng China voluntary. So, again, I just came from the annual South China Sea Conference of the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. Even among the Vietnamese, other ASEAN countries, they're becoming skeptical and cynical with the Code of Conduct. Xi Jinping promised him, by the time you step down from office, we will already have the Code of Conduct. Of course, everyone knows nothing happened.
Yeah. Sir, pero from your point of view, sir, given all these conditions, and these conditions seem like they're non-negotiable for some of the countries involved, may pag-asa ba to?
Well, I think the ball is in the court of the Chinese. After probably the Chinese have fortified, built up their military facilities sa Mischief Reef and those islands they occupied, and nag-ooperate na yung Chinese Navy, Chinese Coast Guard, probably the Chinese would say, let's freeze the situation, we can now have a code of conduct.
Oh, so what do we do?
Is this a code of conduct that we want?
Yeah. So what do we do in the meantime?
Yung exploratory, drilling, where are we there? I mean, with a bilateral meeting and more meetings happening, are we closer and closer to being able to claim that we have every right to exploratory activities within our well-claimed maritime rights?
I think you're referring yung this survey exploration lead back, no? When
Yeah.
President Xi Jinping visited the Philippines in November 2018, we signed a memorandum of understanding for a possible service contracting. So you have a private Philippine company that would subcontract a Chinese company that would do the survey. But of course, ang arrangement dito, this will be under, of course, Philippine Constitution. That could have been successful, except that the Chinese saw that this might be, by agreeing to this, China would recognize our territorial rights at the reed bank. So that will put them in
Pero
a
di ba
very...
hindi nga tayo pumayag, di ba?
Hindi. Ang ginawa ng China, nag-raise siya ng
Yeah.
conditions, and the last few days of the Duterte administration, Secretary
Right.
Locsin
Nag-
announced na
hindi natuloy.
tuloy. Then of course, this was being raised
So-
again. Yeah, sorry.
Yes.
I-
No, so my question nga is, will this be resurrected? Is there a chance that this will be resurrected?
Well, the bilateral might be raised again by President Marcos, but I think it's high time that we look at the experiences of Indonesia and recently Malaysia. The Indonesians explored yung waters nila do sa North na Tuna Island, no? North na Tuna Sea na tinatawag nila. Malaysia din sa continental shelf niya. They were warned by the Chinese, don't do it. They did it.
Okay.
They did, especially the Malaysians. You know, they were able to
So
do it.
they defied China
They defied
there.
the Chinese.
Yeah.
So probably it's time that we consider what Indonesia and Malaysia did recently. That if you have the political will, if you have the guts, do it.
Yeah.
Just do it, Nike style.
Prof, zoom out ako ng...
Paubos na yung malampaya eh.
Yeah.
Paubos na yung malampaya, di ba? We really need an alternative source of
And then,
energy.
sabi nga ni Justice Carpio, we have the arbitral ruling on our side. We also have the Mutual Defense Treaty. So if the Chinese harass any of our public vessels in the South China Sea, that could be a ground to invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty.
Yeah. But Prof, speaking of the Mutual Defense Treaty, zoom out ako ng konti because we've been looking at this, of course, from the lens of our interests in the Philippines. But zoom out ako sa level ng United States and China once again. Prior to all of these meetings, U.S. President Biden coming out with a statement that in his conversations with Xi Jinping, he said they agreed none of this does not have to descend to a Cold War, he said. But throwing in other contexts here in this larger arena, Taiwan, U.S. looking at that very closely as well. Mutual Defense Treaty being brought up in that context as well. I mean, coming the other way, na tayo naman ang madadamay
Yeah, of
doon.
course.
I mean, these other contexts between Washington and Beijing, what does that mean for us, and what does that mean for again the balancing act that President Marcos would like to strike?
Yeah, we have to look at everything in a calibrated manner because, as Mao said, no, a single spark would start a prairie fire. So because the situation is actually tense, no, that's why you have the summit meeting between President Joe Biden and President Xi Jinping just to manage the competition. But the competition is still there. So the purpose is just to build confidence because they have not yet met. No, since of course President Biden assumed office in January 2021, they haven't met as heads of states. So again, we have to factor everything what we're doing in the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea, and other issues in the wider context that there is an ongoing great power competition. Yeah, I agree with you. That's it. Yeah, we have to take it into account.
Okay. Okay, well, Professor Renato De Castro, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this segment. Sir, maraming salamat po.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much po.
Thank you, sir.
Gandang gabi po sa inyo lahat.
And we'll start up another conversation after this breather. The Chiefs will be right back.
department attributes the country's COVID-19 vaccine wastage to hesitancy and complacency.
Matapos aminin ng Department of Health na milyong-milyong doses ng COVID vaccine ang na-expire na, iginiit ng ahensya na pwede pa itong mapakinabangan.
DOH officer in charge, Maria Rosario Vergeire, said they are now looking to hold another Bakunahang Bayan in December for kids aged 5 to 11 years old. Vergeire also noted that wasted vaccines are up for replacement.
Rest assured, this 31 million, meron pa pong mababawas dyan. Kasi may commitment pa rin naman po sa atin ng COVAX facility to replace those which have expired already. Meron pa rin po tayong inaantay dyan na pwede pang ma-extend further ng mga manufacturers based on scientific or laboratory studies.
Vergeire also maintained that the agency is open to any form of audit on vaccine budget spending.
We are very much open if the Commission on Audit will have some form of audit sa amin para po makita nila kung paano natin spinend yung money po na allocated for the COVID-19 vaccines.
Holidays for healthcare workers waiting for their COVID-19 allowance. We talk about this and other issues concerning the health department with health officer in charge, Undersecretary Maria Rosario Vergeire. Welcome back to Chiefs, ma'am, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Yes, good evening po sa inyo lahat. Magandang gabi po.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, let's start off with vaccines. Last time we had you here, which was last month, you talked about the government being ready to purchase the bivalent vaccines, except that we just have to wait for regulatory approval by the FDA of the vaccines of, I think, Pfizer and Moderna. Any update there?
Yes, sir. So currently po, ang FDA is in the process of evaluating already the submitted applications for EUA of Pfizer and Moderna. So ang Pfizer po nag-submit noong November 8 at ang Moderna po nag-submit noong November 12. So we have 21 days based from the process kung saan binibigyan ng FDA para ma-evaluate at mailabas po ang EUA. HTAC also in parallel has done their evaluations already. So as soon as FDA releases the EUA, HTAC can provide the recommendations.
In the meantime, ma'am, have we begun negotiations for the purchase of these vaccines, or we have to wait for the approval first before we even begin talking?
No, we did our negotiations. We started almost 2 months already negotiating with the manufacturer. Actually, we've signed our term sheets already. There is this estimate na rin kung magkano po at kung ilan ang una nating bibilhin. So naandyan na po lahat. So we're just really waiting for the EUA from FDA and then we can go through these negotiations with it.
May mga report na magiging very limited yung bivalent, no? Kasi mahina na nga daw yung booster uptake. Is that correct?
When we talk about limited, ma'am, we are going to procure limited number of doses muna at the start. We have seen our experience based from these original vaccines where medyo nagkaroon na ng hesitancy yung mga tao, bumaba po yung uptake. So we don't want to have that kind of situation again. So for the meantime, at the start, we are going to procure for those priority populations. And then as interest will increase, madali po tayong order. May usapan po tayo with manufacturer na easily we can be able to reorder and have the deliveries at once.
Suggestion ni Joey Concepcion, magpa-pre-register daw ng mga may gusto ng bivalent. Is that a feasible proposal?
I think that's going to be very tedious, no? At saka yun para mas malimitahan pa natin yan because if in any time meron pong mga tao na biglang gusto na nila walk-in kasi we will be allowing din in the eventually, no? So ang ginawa po namin, we did a survey. We had small surveys in different areas of the country kung saan lumalabas dun sa survey those who have received the first and second boosters, mga 90 to 92% po ay very much willing to receive the bivalent. Those who received the first 2 doses, yung primary series, around 68% are interested, no, in receiving the bivalent. So with that, we have used that in estimating muna how much we need, and of course, it's going to be based on the priorities depending on the science that we have right now.
How urgent is vaccination at this point, considering that well, Dr. Salvania has said that we're approaching endemicity, and then at the same time, you yourself say that we have to overcome that vaccine hesitancy and now complacency. So my question is really, at this point, can we even ever hope to get people interested again in being vaccinated in view of the endemicity prospect? And yun na nga, no, na parang we've already experienced nga low uptake of the vaccines and the boosters these past months.
Well, in order for us to really get into that stage where the disease becomes endemic, we need to up our vaccination because we need to have that population immunity before we can really say that we are at that endemic stage. Ito pong ating ginagawa ngayon, we are still intensifying our efforts because we know that the population needs this. If you can notice or you have observed that the cases in the country will go up and then it will go down, go up, go down. There are still severe and critical cases being admitted in our hospitals. There are still deaths, although very minimal, but we do not want that anymore. That's why we would want that the population receive the vaccines, especially po yung booster, because the immunity has already waned and it's based on evidence.
Ma'am, international travel has really started to open up, going outside, coming our way as well. A lot of people, of course, are comparing our policies coming into the country with the countries they're visiting outside. Wala nang mga permits, wala nang mga tests required to travel, and so on. And then coming back, meron pa rin tayong One Health Pass. Are you having that conversation on whether or not that's due for an update or an adjustment, especially given that even in the One Health Pass, pag uwi sa Pilipinas, wala na rin nagtetest, wala na rin nagsiscreen?
Yes, it has already been updated actually, and it has been implemented, I think, for almost more than a month already, where the One Health Pass was replaced by the e-arrival card.
Yeah.
This e-arrival card is much simpler, more streamlined, kung saan kaunting detalye na lang po ang nilalagay ng ating mga kababayan. Aside from replacing that, we also have relaxed our restrictions, where even those who do not have vaccination can already enter the country as long as they have a pre-departure antigen test 24 hours before their flight. So lahat naman po ay medyo na-ease na natin ng restriction so that it can be more convenient for our travelers to go in and out of the country. But of course, surveillance would still be there. Kaya ang e-arrival card ay kailangan pa rin po because based on law, we need to do still surveillance, no? Not just for COVID-19, but for the other diseases as well.
Ma'am, we talked to some people from the health sector the other week, and they mentioned a different kind of vaccine hesitancy. Well, supposedly, that's why we need to get confirmation from you. Supposedly, there are some pharmaceutical companies that are hesitant to go into large contracts with government until or unless there is a permanent health secretary who can sign on behalf of the government. Is there any truth to that?
Now, well, based from my authority that was given to me, specifically it stated that I can go into this kind of agreement so that there are no disruption of services.
Yes, ma'am.
And I think it is part of what we are doing right now. Although for this specific negotiation, we have officially communicated to the Office of the President to give me that specific authority na lang para walang questions, but that I can go through this negotiation for us to be able to procure these vaccines.
Yeah. Ma'am, I don't think there's any question naman about the conference of Malacanang on you or with you. I think that's planchado naman. We're wondering lang if there was any hesitancy on the part of the manufacturers because of the technicality. Quite simply, that you are still OIC and you have not been appointed or given an appointment as secretary.
There has never been any kind of discussions on that matter. In fact, when we started our negotiations with the manufacturer, the question on who to sign it was quite clear. And it was going to be the Secretary of Health or the OIC Secretary of Health. So I don't think there would be any problem as long as Malacanang, we are asking for a specific authority so that there are no issues and there are no questions that we will be encountering once we get into this negotiation.
You said magkakaroon ng bakunahang bayan on December 5 to 7. So, meron ba kayong iniisip any new approach to encourage more vaccination uptake? Kasi parang wala nang interest mga tao.
Yes, ma'am. No? So, syempre yung ating community mobilization would be very important. So, we have added social mobilizers to our community so that they can be informed, explained to before the December 5 to 7 na bakunahang bayan. Pangalawa, mas intensive yung bahay-bahay natin ngayon na bakunahan. Kung dati yung mga nakakatanda lang talaga ang talagang pinuntahan natin sa bahay. Ngayon, yung ating mga komunidad, yung mga workers natin doon, if they can be able to do that, they are going to the different houses so that we can provide the vaccines. And of course, ang ating mga vaccination sites sa mga common public places ay andun pa rin na ilalagay natin.
Wala pa kayong balak mga promo uli, halimbawa mga incentives with the private sector?
Libreng kalabaw.
Well, we are working. No, we are going to work with the private sector. Actually, the last time we worked with the private sector, the SM Foundation, talagang lahat ng malls nila bukas, nagbibigay din ng incentives sa ating mga kababayan doon sa mga SM malls natin. Talagang mababa lang talaga yung uptake, yung mga tao ay talagang parang busy na with moving on with their lives. So hopefully this time around, December 5 to 7, we will intensify and we're going to go to those areas that really are unreached para mas makita natin at baka mabigyan pa natin, baka wala pa rin primary series itong mga kababayan natin ba.
Ma'am, medyo malaki yung shortfall no? Parang ang laki na hahabulin yung numbers. I think it's in the vicinity of 60 or 70 million. Paano po kaya maeengganyo nga yan mga yan? Lalo na ang impression po ngayon ng tao ay napakadali naman pala na nitong bagong COVID na to. Hindi naman lumalala ang mga condition namin masyado para lang kami nag-flu. That's the general impression now of people about COVID. How do you fight that? Even though you say na, nako, marami pa rin, up and down, is there any special plan to combat this impression nga that COVID is behind us now and there's nothing to fear?
Oh, well, that might be true. No, that's really true. And we are observing that among our people, the citizens. But people have to remember also that the virus is continuously mutating. And nakandama na nila lahat ng letra ng variants na yan, nakita na natin. And the more that it mutates, the more that it becomes evasive, the more that it becomes transmissible. Kaya ngayon, pag nakita nyo po, ang transmissibility natin ay napakataas. No? So kung ganyan po yung nangyayari, kahit na tayo ay may primary series, dadating tayo sa point na especially those vulnerable, they might get the severe and critical infections. And that would be very parang risky for them. Kaya nga po kami, araw-araw pinapaalalahanan natin, yung bakuna po talaga would really bring us to that endemic stage that we want, na para wala tayong pinoproblema na magkakaroon ng mga ganitong sitwasyon.
And gaya nga po na parati pinag-uusapan natin, it's not just about the individuals. Ultimately, we're also trying to protect our health systems from being overloaded, both logistically and as well as in terms of manpower. In terms of manpower po, moving forward and in the long term, what have we put in place para yung mga pinoproblema natin na may surplus, at the same time may shortage ng nurses, nagkukulang ng doktor, what have we put in place? What are we more confident about now?
Right now, we are closely working with our academic institutions, closely working with CHED, so that we can purposively produce our very own. So we have different interventions, strategic interventions. Meron tayong mga ginagawa with the UP College of UP Manila. Yung different deans nila, minute po natin ng isang linggo because we wanted to share with them our issue on our healthcare workers, and they are very much willing to help us. So meron po tayong step-ladder approach kung saan they are having these scholars sa mga komunidad natin na pwedeng halimbawa midwife muna the first 2 years, babalik sa community, tapos after those 2 years, pwede nang mag-aral uli, paging nurse naman, additional 2 years, so on and so forth. So sa CHED naman, meron ho tayong mga nakaabang na mga scholarships so that we can further incentivize also those who are going to work in our hospitals and in the public sector. So nakikipag-usap din po tayo sa DOLE at sa Migrant Workers Department, kay Sec. Tuts Ople, para magkaroon po tayo ng agreement yung bang may cap ba tayo because we desperately need our healthcare workers but unfortunately most of them are going out. So ito po yung mga pag-uusap ngayon and hopefully by next year meron ho tayong maumpisahan na talaga para we can produce our own healthcare workers and add on to the workforce that we have right now.
What about po pag-uusap sa ibang bansa, sa gobyerno ng ibang bansa? Kasi alam naman po natin, the problem has never been producing. In fact, we've been producing quite well. The problem has been, as you pointed out, hanging on to our people and the fact that there is real demand for our people, especially given the high quality of our health workers. No? Kasama po ba sa mga kinakausap din natin yung ibang bansa? At ano po ang response nila?
Yes, we had initial discussions initially with Department of Migrant Workers, Sec. Tuts, na sabi natin, baka pwede pag nakikipag-usap ka sa mga bilateral agreements natin through bilateral agreements with other countries that we can have exchange halimbawa programs with them, kukunin man nila yung mga healthcare workers natin, papayag tayo for a certain number, pero may kapalit naman na parang scholarships o kaya exchange programs for us so that we can better incentivize our workers to stay here or kaya ay magkaroon sila ng career path kapag nagtatrabaho sila sa gobyerno o sa mga ospital. We also are in talks, no? Especially the ambassadors who go to us and discuss with us. One example would be the U.S. ambassador, wherein we also presented to them our issue on healthcare workforce, and they are very much willing to help us. So exchange program for our hospital personnel in US also, so that we can develop our expertise as well as with the other ambassadors. No? So ito pong mga ganitong pag-uusap ay can greatly help us in giving that kind of improvement in the incentives that we give to our workers as an additional parang incentive for them to stay and have a career here in the government.
Ma'am, let me set aside COVID for a while and ask you what other health challenges are we facing now as a nation? Because I remember that a couple of days ago, you actually raised the alarm on obesity. Malaking problema na ba ngayon yan sa mga Pilipino? And is that a result of the pandemic that we were at home and immobile for 2.5 years?
Yes, ma'am. That's very true. During this time of the pandemic, there was this increase in the number of obese individuals in the country. Ang medyo troubling talaga ay nakita natin among 5 to 10 years old, nakita natin from just 9%, yung ating statistics in 2018, naging 14% ang obese children, yung 5 to 10 years old. So that really reflects on how we have done so far during the time of the pandemic kasi walang nakakalabas, walang exercise, nakaupo tayo lahat, nanonood ng TV or nagzo-zoom tayo as fast food chains because online ordering talaga ay napaka-rampant noon. So all of these things contributed to this increase in obesity among our children and even adult individuals. So nakikita natin ngayon lahat ng mga lifestyle na risk natin based doon sa recent na survey ay tumaas. Binge drinking, smoking, physical inactivity, poor diet. So lahat yan tumaas yan. So these are the risk factors for us to have non-communicable diseases. So we are seeing maybe eventually in a number of years, magde-develop ng hypertension, ng sakit sa puso, may masustroke. Lahat yan ay magiging burden sa ating healthcare system.
Yung walang papasok ng healthcare workers, no? Last week, nagpo-protesta sila eh. Yung mga natatakot na isasara daw yung RITM kapag ginawa na yung Center for Disease Control. What can you tell those workers?
That is not true. Why will we close the institution wherein this institution is something that we rely on, especially on in this kind of situations. Ang RITM po, isasubsume natin sa Center for Disease Control ng Pilipinas, kung saan yung iba't ibang bahagi ng RITM ay papasok sa iba't ibang centers to sa Center for Disease Control. For example, their laboratories would be under the Center for Health Laboratories sa CDC. Yung kanila pong mga ospital at iba pang mga studies or trials na ginagawa mapupunta sa Center for Health Evidence. So there is no truth that RITM will close. It will now be a part of the Center for Disease Control. In fact, mas mag-i-improve pa, mas lalawak kasi mapupunta sa CDC at mas magkakaroon po ng institutionalized systems and processes together with the other offices of the department.
Mag-hire kaya ng additional health workers sa ginagawa mo?
Yes, ma'am, definitely. And based on the law for the CDC, the one that we are proposing, no, at naipasa na nga dun sa first reading sa ating committee sa health at saka sa Ways and Means sa House of Representatives, meron po tayong mga i-hire highly qualified individuals. May mga credentials na kailangan para makapasok kasi mga scientist po ang atin pong tatanggapin at ilalagay dyan sa ating Center for Disease Control.
Ma'am, pahabol lang.
Mapahabol ng tanong, yun daw pong vaccert. Hindi ba DOH na po yan? Alam nyo, ang dami pa rin mga walang vaccert. Isa na ako ron. Ano po ba ang dahilan at naantala po yung mga vaxcerts na yan? At paano pong pabibilisin para yung mga kailangan ng vaccert makakuha na agad?
Yes, ma'am. I'd just like to clarify, no, the DOH is the owner of vaccert. Katulong po natin ng DICT dito at na-extend nga po natin yung usapan natin with DICT na matapos muna po hanggang matapos ang taon bago nila talaga fully i-transition sa amin because we do not have that expertise. Ang vaccert po, nag-uumpisa po yan dun sa proseso sa local government. Kapag nagbakuna po ang local government, kailangan na i-encode po nila at na i-upload nila dun sa sistema para makapasok at mahanap dun sa vaccert. So usually, when a person is looking for their vaccert as kulang, binabalikan natin ng local government para tanungin yung datos ng specific na tao na yun para may upload na maayos at makuha natin ang vaccert. So the key here would be the encoding of our local governments.
Ma'am,
So
pahabol din.
yung local governments ang short, ang kulang. Hindi DICT, hindi DOH. Ganun po ba yun? Kasi
Yes,
ang
po.
dami po talagang wala pang vaccert na taon na binibilang.
Start po kasi ng process yun. Kapag nai-upload ng LGU yan, papasok na sa sistema, then the ICT can already generate yung vaccert nila kasi naandun na po yung datos nila. Ang local governments po kasi, syempre sa dami rin po naman ang kanilang mga ginagawa ngayon, multitasking talaga sila, meron po talagang nagkakaroon sila ng delays. And sometimes, meron din naman po na it takes them long before they can upload, nagba-bulk uploading sila at doon din po tumatagal ang proseso.
Ma'am, pahabol lang na Christmas question. Yung COVID allowance po ng mga health workers, kumustahin po namin kung... kasi I understand yung target is to release it before Christmas. Ano ho ba? Is there a good chance?
Well, actually, I just like to clarify and inform everybody. We've already downloaded our funds to all of our regional offices. As soon as we received the 11 billion that was released by the Department of Budget and Management, we released it immediately. Binigay na sa lahat ng regions. Ngayon, yung regional offices namin, waiting for specific facilities and implementing units para magsumite ng requirements sa kanila para ma-release. Nung tinignan mo namin yung aming disbursement accomplishments, nakita namin na among our government facilities and implementing units, mataas po ang ating disbursement na ibibigay ng maayos. Although, syempre kulang pa, hindi pa ganun kaano. Pero nandun ho tayo sa mga 80% po ang ating rate. But if we look at our private sector, nasa mga 40+% lang. And we tried investigating what's happening. So many of our private sector facilities and implementing units, unang-una, hindi pa ho sila makapagsumite ng mga requirements katulad ng mga MOA, ng maayos na listahan ng kanilang healthcare workers. Pangalawa po, yun naman pong iba, hindi pa nakaka-liquidate ng previous na funds na na-download namin sa kanila. And that is a requirement. They cannot they cannot just not submit because that's part also of the requirement of government based on the rules and regulations ng ating audit procedure. So kailangan po talaga makumpleto bago maibigay sa kanila yung pera. But the money is there already.
Okay, we'll have to end on that note. Undersecretary Maria Rosario Vergeire, ma'am, maraming salamat po.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Salamat, ma'am.
Maraming salamat po.
Yusek Vergeire, of course, is OIC of the Department of Health. And that is it for the chiefs. We hope it was discussed. We'll keep the conversation going. Ako po si Robbie Alampay.
I'm Mami Pamituan of the Philippine Star.
I'm Lucy Cruz Valdez of News 5.
I'm Ed Lingao. We are One News, all sides, all the time.